Good evening and welcome to the National Conservation Training Center. My name is Mark Madison, along with Randy Robinson. I'm one of the organizers of this Conservation Lecture Series. It's been going on 26 years, and we have quite an exciting lineup this year. So I need to thank a couple people. The Friends of NCTC is a long-term sponsor of this. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have a good contingent of Shepherd University students. Shepherd, of course, being the Harvard of West Virginia. Their students are very interested in conservation biology. We also have some NCTC students. Excited to see you all. Drop the demographic a little, which is wonderful. Now let me introduce our exciting speaker tonight. Tom Serfass is a professor of wildlife ecology at Frostburg State University, and his research and conservation activities have focused on the design, implementation, and evaluation of wildlife restoration programs and recovering wildlife populations. He conceived and coordinated the successful Pennsylvania river otter and fisher reintroduction projects, and he's authored over 40 journal proceedings, popular articles, and book chapters. During the past 14 years, Tom has mentored the completion of 38 master's and PhD students conducting research while evaluating the fates of river otters reintroduced in western New York, to assessing the natural history and conservation value of spotted neck otters and other wildlife, get this, at the Robondo Island National Park, Lake Victoria, Tanzania. So not only is he a local, but he's been doing conservation globally. He's the North American coordinator of the IUCN Natural Resources Otter Specialist Group. How many of you in the audience have seen a river otter? Fair number of you. Well, those of you that haven't, I'm going to hazard to guess you'll see a bunch of them tonight. So please give a very warm welcome to Tom Serfass.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely really local. Trust me. Can you hear me okay with this? Okay, good. So, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. It's been a while since I visited the center. I am through this area quite a lot, though. We've had a remote camera project along the C&O Canal, and what a resource the canal is. I don't think I appreciated it as much until we got started with this project, but we've had the camera every 2 miles, literally from Cumberland down to the DC area. And we're looking at the variety, including cameras very close to the community here. The community changes here. We see a whole lot more joggers along the towpath as we get into this region than elsewhere. But that's been an interesting project. We didn't focus specifically on river otters, but the purpose with the Park Service is to better assess and better understand the value of the C&O Canal and that forested shoreline, the riparian area, for the dispersal and interactions of carnivores, including with some adjacent public lands to the north of the canal. Actually, we have cameras as far north as the Catoctin area. And it's interesting. We a little bit further west, lots of fishers, lots of all relatively speaking. Black bears, those animals tend to diminish in numbers as we move eastward. But we do have fishers close to Harper's Ferry, bobcats a little bit further east, and occasional black bears east of Route where the canal goes under Route 15. So it's been an interesting project, and we have found otters along the way, including down into the DC area. Where they're originating from, West Virginia reintroduced them, Maryland reintroduced them. The Chesapeake Bay has always had an otter population, so it's probably an admix of otters coming from various areas, but there's some spots where we find their sign quite a lot, and you'll see during this program, we don't see otters that often. I'm glad that so many people in the audience have seen otters, but they're really difficult to view in the wild, which gets into some of the vexing issues. A lot of people like otters. And I think they're given their association with clean water, I think they're a good animal to promote clean water, which gets into the concept of a flagship species, a species that you sort of put the flag up the flagpole to raise attention to bigger issues, in this case an environmental issue. But a good flagship species is also a species that's easily viewed, and the otters are generally not easily viewed. We know from our remote camera studies they tend to be largely nocturnal, crepuscular, dawn and dusk, occasionally active during the daylight hours, but not as much. One place, has anyone been to a place called Trout Lake in northeastern Yellowstone National Park in the Lamar Valley? Has anyone been out that way? Not so much. That is one of the places, actually a lot of the pictures, including this picture on the first slide, where you could see river otters pretty regularly, and they were very, very tolerant of people, as long as the people were, minding some reasonable distance, but you could photograph them quite easily. I was and I didn't approach this otter, it approached me, so I took this picture probably from about 10 or 15 feet away, which again is not something that happens all that regularly. If I keep talking, we're never going to get through my 50 slides in a reasonable amount of time. We called this Reintroducing River Otters, but then I added past, current, and future conservation implications. So with the program, I'm going to get into historical aspects of conservation in general, why we had to have otter reintroduction projects in many states, where we've gone since the successful reintroduction projects, and they have largely been successful. So we have a major conservation success story in terms of restoring a predatory animal that had declined significantly. But along the way, I think we've done some things professionally that are questionable, especially as we transition from establishing populations to how we dealt with a fur-bearing animal. And I'll tell you, my attitude here is not anti-consumptive. But I think as professionals, we also need to be very cautious about how we do portray an animal to the public. And there's so much marketing at all levels of society now. We see it at the highest levels of government, but we see it at different levels also. And we all have our own particular agendas. And I think and that's the way it's going to be. But I think we need to be honest in the way we promote our various agendas. And that includes those of us who are advocates of wildlife, because as soon as we are disingenuous or dishonest with the public, it's going to harm our mission also. So I think education is important, but I also think how we do that education. I mean, there's manipulative ways that you can show a picture of a cute animal that likes to slide down the snow, and you can manipulate people's thoughts that way. I don't think we should be doing that. Yes, you want to show pretty pictures if you have them, but we also want to be honest with the public, and I'll get into that a little bit also. My background with river otters started really when I was an undergraduate student, and I guess there's some students here from the university. I started working with a graduate student. I always liked otters. For various reasons, I've liked otters. I like their behavior, I like the way they looked, I like the fact that they're around the water. I have always enjoyed aquatic habitats. So I started working with that student on an independent study. That led to a master's degree, and it led to a PhD, and it led really to the rest of my life. What I've been able to do is largely predicated on what I've done with this animal. So yeah, I kind of owe this animal something, and it's a little bit difficult for me to not be biased when I talk about the animal because it's facilitated so much for me. And I think I was a 24-year-old kid when we started this river otter reintroduction project, and it's one of the few reintroduction projects that was really initiated, conceived, implemented, of course with support from the State Wildlife Agency, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, but it was through the universities for the most part, which is unusual among the 22 states where reintroduction projects occurred. The reason for this slide, I think if you're going to be successful with a reintroduction project, you need to integrate. with the various entities that are out there, the different land management agencies, the different NGOs that are interested in wildlife. And this is only a few. And I was fortunate to learn this fairly early on, and I had some very nice mentors. So we worked with the Pennsylvania DCNR. We went, as a matter of fact, you see the license plate up there. They developed this license plate with the otter. And again, it served to promote aquatic conservation. It also raised, every time somebody buys this otter license plate, it raises $15 for conservation, wildlife conservation in Pennsylvania. Of course, the Pennsylvania Game Commission permits and support from them. We worked with Audubon Society. We worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We worked with the U.S. Forest Service, the National Forest Foundation. 3 different universities were involved. Actually more, because we interacted a whole lot. And then if you look at the lower right corner of this slide, you have the New York River Otter Project and the Maryland DNR. And the otter could care less if it's on the Pennsylvania or the Maryland side of a border that a stream or a river system is flowing through. So we had nice interactions with New York in reintroducing otters on shared drainages, same with the Maryland DNR, and those interactions were very positive along the way too. I'm not going to talk primarily about reintroduction projects, but the approach that we developed, this conceptual model, site selection, obviously you're going to spend money, time, and the lives of animals. You want to have appropriate habitat conditions. And one of the reasons that river otters declined was degraded water quality. So had the water quality, the acid mine drainage aquatic systems in western Maryland, had that been remedied? Was there appropriate prey available? So site selection is critical. And again, we're getting into a lot of ethical things here. You don't want to just take an animal, throw it out into a new landscape, and hope that it survives. That's highly unethical. It's unethical for the animal, it's unethical for the money that you're using, which is often public-derived funds. So important to look at habitat conditions if you're going to do a reintroduction project. One thing that we often overlook, especially as wildlife biologists, we get into this because we like animals and we like being outdoors. We don't necessarily get into it because we are great with the public. Public relations is essential. You need the public support. Predator attitudes have been, negative predator attitudes have been with us since the inception of our wildlife management system in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Things have improved, but it's still a problem. You can't blame people who do most of their recreation and benefit financially from recreational activities to say, great, let's throw a predator in here and eat the fish that we enjoy recreating on, feeding on, and derive funds from tourists coming to an area, such as in north central Pennsylvania. So how do you convey a message to the public? How many otters do you need? How many animals do you need for a reintroduction project? That gets into genetic issues as well. The other ethical issue is caring for those animals. Yes, you can just go out and catch an animal, put it in a box, put it in a cage, transport it somewhere, and let it go. We didn't do that. We always put them through a captive management program. We had veterinarians evaluating them. If we would have just released otters, one animal that we had, we would have been releasing a rabid animal into the wild, which could have caused a problem. Our captive management program caught that. And then some type of monitoring. The last thing you want to do is start throwing animals into the wild, into the new landscape, not knowing if they're surviving. So we did radio telemetry work also with the initial ones. And I say with the initial ones because with otters, you can't put a radio collar around their neck very easily. Their necks, because of their streamlining, tends to be larger in circumference than their head. Somebody who walks around a lot like I do on a stage like this, it would be very entertaining if I dropped off the side here. So I'm going to back up a little bit. But it's not ethical to just take animals, put them out, and not knowing if they're going to survive or not. So the initial animals, we would put radio transmitters internally. implantable radio transmitters. And there's an ethical issue with that also, putting a transmitter inside an animal. There could be complications related to that. But we needed to know if they were going to survive. We only did it with the initial animals, and I can tell you, we never saw any evidence of problems with the transmitters. As a matter of fact, there was one otter that was killed 10 years after she was released, accidentally by a beaver trapper at one of the capture sites. And when we did the necropsy, the equivalent of a human autopsy, she was fine. Actually, she had 2 young in her. For a 10-plus-year-old otter, that's good indication that the habitat was suitable, the fact that she's 10 years old and still reproducing. So that's the conceptual model that we followed. And I am going to bring up pieces of this along the way. So we had, when we started this project, a native population persisting in northeastern Pennsylvania. So the population wasn't extirpated statewide. This region of the state in particularly had been badly impacted by the early coal industry, a lot of acid mine drainage, really eliminated the fishery in many of those areas. The early oil industry was a problem for the otter also, as well as other aquatic organisms. That we felt had generally been remedied throughout most of the areas where we were working. Why did the otter persist in the Northeast? Well, Pennsylvania is glaciated in the Northeast and the Northwest. And when the glaciers came south, they left behind, as they retreated, lots of wetlands, small to medium-sized lakes in the Northwest and the Northeast. So there was a greater amount of aquatic habitat available for the otter. So why did the otter, with sort of similar habitat conditions, persist in the Northeast but not the Northwest? Probably related, at least in part, to land holding patterns. So the Pocono Mountains, everybody kind of knows the Poconos as the honeymoon capital, at least of Pennsylvania. I wouldn't call it the world. So there's a lot of resorts there, and there's a lot of large private hunting and fishing clubs whose members tend to be wealthy, so they're exclusive. And I worked on a lot of those areas. We got otters from many of those areas. The general public was excluded, so in a lot of ways they were refuges. And whereas it was more open in the Northwest, and the other problem for the otter was unregulated trapping. And it still can be a concern for them, especially in riverine habitats, streams and rivers, because it's not a whole lot of aquatic habitat. They have large home ranges, low population densities. So overtrapping was a big problem for the otter, especially historically before we had wildlife agencies to manage this. So started in the north central part of the state, evaluated that. They seemed to do well, and they seem to have expanded considerably. Moved to the northwest, down to the southwest, where we work with the Maryland DNR, and then the last site was in central Pennsylvania in the Juniata River drainage. Overall, about 151 otters, 150 plus otters released. If you look at otters released in shared drainages between Maryland and Pennsylvania and New York, well over 200 otters were released among these drainages. And like I say, I was a kid. I'm not sure I should have been allowed to do this at 24 years of age, but fate is what it is. I learned a lot along the way. I grew up rural. That helped because I could talk to the rural folks quite well. They grew up like I did in north central Pennsylvania. But there were concerns about whether otters should be released. And getting to the public education aspect of this, and the young people in the audience, this is what we tend to forget sometimes in wildlife ecology and conservation. Most of us are going to be public servants. We're going to work for a state agency, a federal agency, a state university like I do. So our jobs, we're working for the public. It's important to be honest with the public, and it's important to realize that wildlife is a public resource in the United States. So we're responsible for them, and ultimately we're responsible to managing that wildlife responsibly for the public. So we need to listen to them and not manipulate them. So we need to communicate with them. We need to engage them. And we need to educate them. And educating them is different from manipulating them to get what we want. And if you're honest with people, they tend to be honest with you. They're not always going to be agreeing with you, but it's okay to disagree, just so you do it honorably. So when we would start a reintroduction project, we would let out news releases. And we did that. About a week later, sportsmen upset at otter stalking. This is in north central Pennsylvania. Big recreation area, Potter County. Some of you may have heard of that. Big deer hunting area. That's a big fishing area also. Group fears trout may be endangered. Otters have been gone from that area for over 100 years. All they knew is what they had heard from friends, relatives, ancestors. It's not unusual to have negative attitudes about predators. We anticipated this, and we had prepared presentations. Back then it was 35 millimeter slides, not PowerPoint presentations. We talked to them. About a week later, after the meeting with this group, Sportsman's Back Otter Stalking Program. They had a small hatchery where the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission would give them fingerlings to raise and then release in the local streams. There was concern about the otters getting in there. And I told Randy this earlier. I offered them screening for their hatchery in case the otters came in. The head of the group stood up and said, no, the money is for the otter stalking. You came and talked to us. We believe you will help us if there's any problems. Keep your money, we'll take care of it. And we know you'll help us. So those types of interactions are critical and they're gratifying and you learn from them. What did we do? Well, simple graphics. This is from northeastern Pennsylvania, which is the smartest thing we ever did. We had food studies. We'd pick up otter droppings along the shoreline, look at them under a microscope. Yes, they ate a lot of fish and they ate a lot of crayfish. As far as the types of fish, crayfish during the summer, which surprised people, were much, much, much more important than fish were. And this is going to vary from aquatic system to aquatic system, but this is the general theme. If you look at trout, and we were honest here, they would put about 70,000 trout into the Pine Creek during the spring of the year for fishing. The otter consumption bumped up to about 17% occurrence in the diet there. Still not a whole lot. But when you look at the sucker, slower moving, more numerous than trout, that's what they were primarily eating, and that's the general theme that we see. So we communicated that information. Then some people would say, okay, they don't eat a whole lot of the game fish, the kind that we like to catch, but they catch big game fish. So we came up with some methodologies for estimating the size of the different fish. And the average size of a fish that the otters eat is about 8 inches. That does not mean they won't eat a larger fish, but on average, it's about 8 inches that they're eating. And that negative newspaper article that I showed you cut deeply into the State Wildlife Agency. And at that point, the State Wildlife Agency thought they were supporting a program that was not supported by the public. So what did we do? We went out and we interviewed the group that we thought would be the most antagonistic. These were trout fishermen. And you go to a meeting and somebody raises their hand and they start complaining and hollering, and the other part of the audience is silent. They just presume they're the minority. So we interviewed people who were actually fishing. They had to have a fishing pole in their hand. And we asked them a whole slew of questions, but one, I'm glad the Pennsylvania Game Commission is supporting a river otter reintroduction project. 83% support, either agree or strongly agree with that statement, 88% on the Pine Creek, 92% on the Tionesta Creek. Tell me a politician nowadays that would not like those numbers. And it also made us realize this animal, with that kind of support, maybe does have the potential to promote bigger conservation issues. When we did the reintroduction projects, we would always invite the public. Sometimes we'd have 400 or 500 people standing on the bank for the reintroduction project. These young boys, this is early 2000s. They're probably in their 30s now. They probably have college degrees, and hopefully they're still talking about the day that they let otters go on the Juniata River. And that was fun for us too. I mean, yes, we like to release the animals. Yes, we enjoyed holding the animals, but it's very gratifying when you see young people like this enjoying it also. Veterinary aspect, I've already talked about that. I'm not going to get into details, but we get that we feed them a calorie-rich diet, lots of nutrients. They're healthier through the veterinary care and the diet after we release them. And if they have any medical issues, we can treat them. And it was very gratifying to work with the veterinarians. Veterinarians often don't have a whole lot of opportunities to work with wildlife, so they enjoy doing this too. It got them away from spaying cats, neutering animals. It also resulted in more stories we could tell during presentations. I started off with these wooden boxes that I built in my uncle's basement. First otter I put in this, we had 2 otters in the room. I didn't know if it was a good idea to put them together in the room. They seemed to be social in the wild, but again, we were just learning. So I put a cage on the front of this box. Next morning, the otter went through the half-inch plywood. The 2 otters were together in the box and happy with one another, so we changed things up. We also changed things up as far as the box. We went with these PVC tubes. Again, we constructed all of these things. They served to allow the veterinarians to drug them. They worked like a big syringe, basically. We had a plunger that we'd push the animals against the screen. We could safely drug them both from our standpoint and their standpoint. It worked very well. This is the biggest otter I've ever handled. I live trapped him on the eastern shore. I forget which wildlife management area. He was almost 40 pounds. That is a big weasel. And they are very strong. They have never had problems with them attacking me, but mostly they will just go into their box and they get used to it, and we would go in the room and we close the box and we could clean it. I was live trapping the otters with now he's time has gone by. Bob Cordes was his name. He's with the Maine Wildlife Agency now. He's done very well. He's a big guy. Played lacrosse in college, played football. He's about 300 pounds, big guy. Very smart, talked very slow. Tom, it's a big otter. So when we caught the otter, one of us had to stay at the university to care for the otter, and so I continued trapping. I get a call. Tom, it's a big otter, he won't go in his box. Don't know what to do. I said, Bob, you got to clean the room and you got to feed him. Day 2, Tom, awful big otter, won't go in his box. Day 3, Tom, it's the biggest blankety-blank otter I've ever seen. I'm not going in that room. So we switched off. But he was fine. We could mop right around him, but he'd scream at us a little bit, but he was a big animal. A 40-pound weasel could probably hurt if he did decide to bite you. They transported very well in these tubes. I won't get into all of that, but the reintroduction project generally went fairly smoothly, and we had good support for it. I'm going to regress here a little bit to a timeline. So what happened to the otter? Well, if we look at these general periods of conservation history in the United States, and these are not fixed timelines, but generally. So we see this period of exploitation. No rules, no regulations, market hunting, unregulated trapping going on throughout a large portion of the continent. The continent was largely explored by beaver trappers in many ways, and otters were being killed during that period also, and after. So then we have a transition period where we start having the state agencies and federal government starting to come into line, or at least thinking about conservation. Most of that transitional period focused on game species, though, particularly ungulates, white-tailed deer, mule deer out west, elk. The maturation period where we start getting into more land conservation, more mechanisms to derive funding, the realization that we needed money if we're going to do conservation. So things are going fairly well. We're restoring wildlife. We're still not focusing on non-game animals very much, and we're not focusing on some of the smaller animals. Technically, the otter, not technically, it is a game animal. It's a fur-bearing species. Then industrialization comes on, associated with World War II and thereafter. There we start seeing bigger, different kind of threats to wildlife in terms of both air and aquatic pollution and other things associated with industry, human population growth. And then we get into this period of environmentalism where we start talking about, where we are right now is hard to decipher because different presidential administrations over, certainly going back to Jimmy Carter and thereafter, certainly have had different attitudes towards conservation. But we see Endangered Species Act, we see wilderness areas being developed, we see more attention being applied to non-game wildlife. And not just restoring wild turkeys and white-tailed deer and beavers, but animals like the otter also. So that exploitation period, I've already talked about it. Unregulated trapping. A lot of the trapping early, especially as we move westward during the early 1800s to about 1850, focused on beavers, but otters and beavers hang out in the same areas, and otters were being killed rapidly during that period also. Even as we started to progress with our thinking about wildlife management, we still were dealing with negative attitudes towards predators, including by the professionals at the time, including our most famous wildlife ecologist, Aldo Leopold. He started as a predator control agent killing wolves in the southwestern United States. Obviously, he had a catharsis and his attitudes changed, but it was a tough time for wildlife. Who manages the river otter? It's not an endangered species, although there was, back in the 60s, there was discussion of that potential. But it's state wildlife agencies. If it's not endangered, if it's not migratory, and there's some other caveats, it's not going to be the Fish and Wildlife Service, although they play an important role, especially through distribution of funds to the states. But the otter is managed by state wildlife agencies. So their jurisdiction is wildlife within their borders, again, with the exception of the endangered and endangered species, migratory birds, and some other rationale. Funding, generally, until recently, we're seeing more alternative funding, but mostly through hunting licenses and Pittman-Robertson funds, which is a tax that's levied on outdoor hunting equipment, guns, ammunitions, archery equipment, 11% tax levied on the manufacturer. That's raised a lot of money, billions of dollars since its inception during the 1930s. Then we start seeing non-game programs, tax checkoffs, where people, if you have money coming back from your state income tax, you can donate a portion of that to non-game wildlife programs. We start seeing artwork. That's an early one in Pennsylvania by Ned Smith, the license plate. But this has been where most of the funding has come from. And the reason that consumptive use is an important focal part of our state wildlife management system, that has what largely has been the driver of funding for a wildlife conservation system until recently. And again, the river otter is managed at the state level, and it is technically a game animal, a fur-bearing animal, although it was protected in many states because its population had declined. So over the last 40 years or so, we see reintroduction starting to occur. As the reintroductions concluded and they were successful, we're also seeing expansion of fur trapping for river otters. Not everyone likes that. It's created some controversy. And I will tell you, I'm one of those people who grew up participating in consumptive activities, I think we could probably harvest almost anything sustainably. I don't think we need to in some cases, especially with predatory animals. But I think we could harvest bald eagles if we wanted to. Now please don't say that Tom Serfass said we need to have a season on bald eagles. Socially, it wouldn't be accepted. We just don't do it. But if you wanted to kill 5 bald eagles every year in Maryland, if we regulated it, we could do it. It wouldn't be accepted. So you have different levels of acceptance. The decline of the river otters resulted in 22 states implementing reintroduction projects. 22 states. They weren't extirpated, completely gone in all of those states, but they were at levels they needed to have a reintroduction project. So all the colored states here had reintroduction projects. So in some of the cases, the otter was gone completely. In some states, like Pennsylvania, it was gone throughout most of the state, persisted in the Northeast, though, native populations that weren't expanding. In coastal areas, Virginia, North Carolina, they had remnant populations persisting in the coastal areas. Why? More aquatic habitat. As you move west, particularly west of the Appalachians, riverine systems, much easier to overexploit an otter there. And that's why most of the reintroduction states were in the central part of the United States. We don't have a lot of natural lakes. We don't have a lot of wetlands. It's mostly riverine systems, streams and rivers. If you step outside here and look around, you're going to see forest, you're going to see lawn. You don't see a whole lot of water. Even if you get down to the Potomac River, it's a fairly substantial body of water, but you look beyond it. Most of the landscape is not aquatic. So you have a specialized animal that requires aquatic habitat. It's a predator, so it tends to occur in low densities and they move a lot. That is a recipe for overconsumption, especially in some habitats. Now you get down into coastal areas. Louisiana has an amazing otter population in the bayou. It's all water. It's more water than upland habitat. Population status, this is remarkable. Considering we reintroduced them in 22 states, they are either stable or expanding, and expanding pretty much everywhere. And if you went back 40 years, we needed to do reintroduction projects. That's tremendous. Prince Edward Island was the only province in Canada at the time of our survey that did not have an otter population. Most recently, in the last 5 years ago, they are recolonizing that area naturally. So you can scratch Prince Edward Island off the list too. So all major jurisdictions. That doesn't mean they're not extirpated in some areas, but generally they've reclaimed large portions of their historic range. Trapping has expanded in recent years, and it got controversial in a variety of ways, which I'll get into. So again, it's not unusual to have an animal that is a game animal, a fur-bearing animal, when populations are thought to recover, to have a trapping season. And the states have been moving in that direction. And we do trap a lot of otters. Our survey, I've updated this since, but when we did the survey up through 2012, the United States had harvested somewhere around 170,000 otters during that period, averaging about 24,000 a year. Canada, fewer, but still a substantial number for predatory animals. So the obvious question is this level of killing sustainable? And I would argue, and I have with the IUCN, the Europeans in the Otter Specialist Group that I'm a member of, they're not very tolerant of consumptive use of wildlife. And I've argued on their listserv that what we're doing is sustainable. I'm not arguing that we have to kill otters. I'm not arguing that we should kill otters, but I am not going to say that it's not sustainable because it's year after year after year. I think we have local extirpations that probably occur, and I think we've also benefited by the fact that fur prices have been low for quite a few years now also. So successful restoration. And I just realized, this is kind of cool, and I should take advantage of it. I'd never experienced this before. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a screen up here now, so I don't have to be looking around the way I was. I just realized that. I can look right there. So low fur prices. What happens when fur prices go up again, if they do go up? I think we do have local extirpations, which could impact people's opportunity to view this animal in certain areas. Monitoring is not intense. There are very few people in the agencies who are going to, I don't know any agency that has a dedicated person to monitoring otter populations, or any fur-bearing animal for that matter. That's not unexpected. But we do have to keep trapping records and CITES, Conservation for International Trade in Endangered Species, because the otter is listed as an Appendix 2, and I won't get into this, but it looks like other otter species that are considered imperiled. So we need to monitor our take and tag the pelts that are going to be exported so that it does not facilitate the killing of endangered otters. Sources of river otters for reintroductions. I'll talk about that in a second, but genetically we haven't done a great job with our reintroduction projects. Most of the otters we used among the 22 states, well over half, came from southern Louisiana. Justification for harvest sometimes have been a little bit sketchy. Differing availability of aquatic habitats. I think if we're going to harvest, we need to consider how much aquatic habitat is available for the species. Prior to initiating trapping season, some states did negative messaging. We cannot do that as wildlife professionals. There's been studies that show if an animal is perceived by the public as a threat to your life, your resources, your pets, your livestock, there's more acceptance to having a harvest on them. That was used, and I think it's a horrible mistake. We have preferred publics. We don't do a whole lot for providing otter viewing opportunities, if that can in fact be done. So certain components of the wildlife community are benefiting in somewhat more by being able to harvest an animal where, and we're dealing with less than 1% of the population that are trappers. And the failure, and I think this is the biggest failure in my mind, to promote the river otter as a flagship species, a species that could be used to promote bigger conservation issues, bigger than the animal itself, aquatic conservation, which benefits a whole host of fish and wildlife species. So just one example here. Almost all of the otters reintroduced came from Louisiana. I used some in Pennsylvania. I kind of regret doing that. Most of our otters came from local sources, though. They were released in portions of the Midwest. They were released in South Dakota. They were released in Arizona. So we have this swamp of genetic material, of the same type of genetic material, that's going to be introgressing, interacting with native otter populations, and possibly having impacts on that. So it is a dilemma, because we have what is generally a popular species for the public based on everything I've been able to determine. They're intelligent, they're playful, the characteristics you think of a flagship species. I was just on a Teams meeting last night with some people at zoos about otters. They're very popular at zoos. Children love them. Adults love them. They're a good species at the zoo. The problem started when Missouri became, in my opinion, the first state to open a trapping season or propose a trapping season on their reintroduced otter population. And the concept of groupthink really took hold there, again, in my opinion. But I have a lot of information on this particular subject. So we get the agency biologists versus the humane groups. I mean, it's a perfect dichotomy. as far as how we believe they believe wildlife should be managed. Then there was a lawsuit in Missouri to stop the proposed otter trapping season. And then somewhere along the line, and this has been shown through human dimension sociological studies, that aspect that conflict sells. If an animal is perceived as a threat to us directly or our resources, we tend to be more supportive of having hunting seasons or trapping seasons. So I started looking at headlines in some of the Midwestern states, including Missouri. Otters at the center of controversy. I need to look down at this. Fur flies over Missouri's cute but greedy river otters. Ozark otter disaster. This is not how a low-density predator is typically functioning. Some otters have gone wild. State river otter overrunning Ohio. You guys probably spend a little time along the Potomac River. You see river otters overrunning the Potomac. It just isn't that way. There was a river otter game developed. Make a long story short, if you did not have a trapping season, this was for kids, otters would overpopulate, overeat their food supply, and then their population would crash. It generally doesn't work like that with most predators. This was also often actually initiated, followed up by the St. Louis Zoo. They didn't know. They just presumed this is a legitimate way of promoting things. Can you imagine what the attitude would be if we changed this into an otter game and called it the bald eagle game or the osprey game? The outrage that would occur. Again, this is not about anti-consumption. This is about manipulating public attitudes. And I think that's problematic and should be problematic. All of our surveys, sociological surveys, indicate that otters can share the stream. And this is just a retake of the earlier graphic that I showed you. But again, in Pennsylvania, with what we thought would be the most adversarial group, we're running greater than 80% support among the various drainages. So we had strong support for the otter. So management of fur bearers. I don't think it's unreasonable at all to expect if you restore a fur-bearing animal that's a game species. I'm being redundant when I say fur-bearing animal and game species, but to expect a season if the population can sustain it. The honest justification for that is we think there's a sustainable number of animals that can be harvested. But when we start negative messaging to gain support for that, that becomes a problem, at least for me and I think for a lot of other people. And it's regressive. It takes us back to the 1920s as far as how we deal with predators and how we think about predators. And what thinking sports person is not going to think, yeah, that otter's a problem. I see an awful lot of mergansers on the river. They must be a problem too. I've been seeing more and more great blue herons. Maybe we ought to deal with them also. It's regressive thinking. And again, thinking people are going to take this, they're going to assume professionals telling them this, giving them this message. Well, the next thought is, what about other predators that we aren't harvesting at all? Now back to the flagship concept. And back to the animal, because I've been talking a lot about policy now. Sadie Stevens, my graduate student, she's the first person I had doing, and she worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service recently. She just changed positions, works for the Forest Service now. This is back in the day of videotape. It's remote camera. The paradigm had been that otters really don't slide as a form of play. They slide as efficient locomotion. You can see they were just efficiently locomoting over this rock along the Youghiogheny River at about 1 a.m. during a snowstorm. This went on for about 15 minutes. Now, again, I can't bottle this and make it happen during the day. But this type of behavior is what people think about with the river otter. We still don't have a better, we've done a lot of remote camera, we still don't have anything better than this. But it does highlight the playful, intelligent nature of this animal, and I think why people tend to enjoy this particular species. You know, we started with this project to see if we could relate it to collecting their scat, which we did see. So again, back to this flagship concept. Flagship is a popular species that is charismatic and is associated with a particular type of aquatic habitat. Penguin in Antarctica, polar bear in the Arctic, the giant panda and bamboo stands in China. Can the river otter serve that purpose for aquatic education? And we have not done it. And I understand why. Because it's hard to promote something and its positive virtues and then have a trapping season also. So I understand the dichotomy and the challenge of this. But there are areas such as protected areas, national parks, where it could be used for that purpose. One problem is with this animal, and a good flagship is viewable. You can go out and see it because it resonates with the public better that way. And that's not the case with the otter. Although I would argue that the otter has in some ways been used as a flagship in Pennsylvania with the license plate. And it beat out the bald eagle and the osprey and the peregrine falcon by popular vote to be on the license plate. Some of you may have seen that license plate. I suspect you probably have. So, but you can't view them very well. So does that negate the value of otters as a flagship species? So we started looking at latrines. Latrines are places along the shoreline where otters hop up on the bank, they go to the bathroom, they put down various scents, they socialize, they interact there through their scents. It also acts as a territorial area. We've been finding them to be biodiversity hotspots, which I'll get into in a second. They're great places for aquatic education. You can go there, you can take kids there, you take adults there. You can quantify the habitat conditions associated with the latrines, their bathrooms, their toilets. You can pick up the scats. You can take them back to a laboratory and look at them under a microscope. And teach people how to identify a sucker scale from a smallmouth bass scale, from a minnow scale, etc. So it serves that educational purpose also. You can do citizen science. We monitor otters by finding their latrines. You don't see the otters that much, but you can find their latrines, and my dog is well versed at doing that. Remote cameras offer another opportunity. Young people like the technology. You don't have just the technology associated with the remote camera, although, I mean, you have cellular cameras now that broadcast the signal. There's all types of sophisticated AI-based data entry systems that will appeal to young people also. Could these be a surrogate? And I had 3 graduate students who really pioneered this kind of work. Sadie Stevens, who worked with me in Pennsylvania, and then also she was involved in we worked with spotted-necked otters at a place called Robondo Island National Park in Tanzania. Zach Olson, these are really good folks. Did remote camera work. Casey Wagnon worked on the biodiversity hotspot. We're finding that other carnivores tend to come to these otter latrines because of the smells that are put down there. What you see Casey, he's working at Channel Islands National Park there after he graduated with his master's degree. He's holding what's called an island fox. He sent me that picture. I said, Casey, what kind of drugs did you use? He said, no drugs. They evolved without predators on the island, and they're extremely docile. So you can just hold it like that. They've had problems because of that also, because various invasive species. Some of the early pictures, these were 35 millimeter slides. That kind of remote camera when we first started doing this, up in Tionesta Creek. We recently have taken the show more on the road. We've been working in the Yellowstone and Grand Teton areas, which is not a bad place to hang out. This is at the Oxbow on the Snake River, if some of you have been out there. So the question we're addressing, are carnivore detections at river otter latrines more frequent than if you just put a camera out? And this is on the Snake River, and otters hanging out at the latrine. This is early morning. You generally don't get to see them like this, but there's young in this group. Marking, and you can see how the other otters respond to that. So they're putting down a lot of different scents at these areas. Whoops. There one was dropping some scats. They have anal scent glands, they have glands in their feet, and it just becomes a large social gathering area. You know, so there's smell here. And I noticed when Sadie Stevens was doing her project, she, you know, there where you're dealing with the 35 millimeter cameras, you get 36 pictures maximum. And we had one where we had 24 exposures, only 24 pictures. And we couldn't wait. You know, we'd bring them back and take them up to Walmart and get them. You know, you could wait for a week to get them developed. We'd pay the extra money to get them done in an hour. So the one roll from Tionesta Creek, we noticed in 24 exposures, we had a fisher, red fox, gray fox, otters, raccoons, mink, coyote. And I thought, geez, you know, that's a lot of other carnivores for 24 pictures. But, you know, we could only go so far with it with that kind of technology. So this is along the Snake River. Yeah, it's not unexpected to get raccoons, although it is out there. Because of the larger carnivores, you don't see the abundance of raccoons out there the way you do here in the absence of the larger carnivores. Red fox is not unexpected. American marten, kind of cool. We don't see those. Skunk. Notice this skunk stiffen the bough of this conifer. And I couldn't understand why they were doing that, and we saw it with others. Coyote sniffing, and when we check that out, there's otter droppings there. Wolves, you don't see those here. Brown black bear, mountain lions, grizzly bear. Look at the claws on the grizzly bear. You know, and these critters are around you when you're out there. I'll tell one story here, and I know I'm getting too long. So I don't necessarily do things that, I would never allow my graduate students to do this, but I'm going into this one spot in the Tetons. It's a pretty long walk in, maybe 3, 4, 5 miles. And I'm going through the one area, and I remember distinctly stopping. And I didn't tell anybody I was going into this spot, and including my wife, although I did call her from this spot. And I just stopped. Teton Mountains, more Teton Mountains, Snake River, more mountains on the other side of the Snake River. I mean, and nobody was around me. It was just magnificent. So I get down to where the otter latrine is, and I have my cameras with me in a backpack, and I see all of this digging, and I can smell the grizzly bear. I mean, they're all around. And it's one of the few times when I went under a tree to set up the camera, I took the bear spray with me. Usually I just left it there. And I was a little bit nervous, and it was kind of dumb going in there without telling somebody where I was. So a month later, I go get the pictures. Me, my rear end walking away in the picture. Next picture, grizzly bear right at the camera. Now, it wasn't like it was 10 minutes after. It was hours after the fact. But I talked with the Park Service. They said, yeah, for whatever reason, the grizzly bears were really dense in there during that particular time period. But it is a really energizing feeling when you're around an animal like this. And again, we don't see wolves. When I first looked at this with a small viewer, I thought it was a 3-legged wolf, but no, it's carrying a calf head. And this is all going on at these otter latrines. And we have random cameras, not random, but paired cameras set up at non-latrine sites also. So remember that skunk sniffing the bow? You could be out every day looking for this, and you never see it without the remote camera. The otters, we found, are pulling the boughs down, and they must be marking on them, and that's why the other animals are sniffing the boughs. Without the cameras, you would never know that. And we had we had raccoons sniffing them, we had badgers sniffing them, so that's why they were sniffing the boughs. And it makes sense. They get they want to communicate with the olfaction, so raising up the smell, it's going to dissipate further. What else do we get? Mountain lions coming through. Now I could have a heck of a time saying that this was along the Potomac River. But what the mountain lion was doing there, they're not just walking through, it's responding to the scent, so it's overmarking. It's urinating where the otters had scent, so it's responding to the otters. We do get these animals at our paired camera sites, but they don't do things like that. They don't hang around, they just walk through. They're not sniffing at the site. And honestly, I've enjoyed reintroducing otters. I have all kinds of stories about them in captivities. But the remote camera stuff at the latrines has been, you just never know what you're going to get. So it also has a utility aspect of it. You don't have to rebait. Generally when you're using a remote camera, you're putting some kind of bait in front of it to attract the animals. The otters are attracting it. They can be long-term sites because the otters are there all the time. You're also monitoring the otters. And you may not be able to use bait in national parks where you have these big carnivores. And you can imagine why. The Park Service probably is not going to want you putting out bait that's going to attract this guy where people might be. Or where this mom and her 3 cubs were. Again, I've never had more fun than putting out these cameras in the Tetons where these big carnivores are. Things you just don't see every day. And I'm trying to find out, you remember there's an iconic grizzly bear sow in the Tetons. She was killed last year. I have to find out whether we have any pictures of her because she was really well known. So where do we want to go with this? The otter, I think with the cameras and the latrines, it does offer up a whole lot of opportunities. We were working with the Yellowstone Association, and we'd like to have some paired educational studies with school children. Ideally out west, Native Americans who don't get a whole lot of opportunities for things like this. And at places like Ohiopyle State Park, we're not too far from Pittsburgh, so inner city kids that don't get outdoors a lot, and have them do educational otter-based programs focused again on the river otter. And then again, our work over in Africa. We can't take kids from here over to Africa and have shared experiences, but with the virtual technology, we could have them doing similar projects. These kids from Tanzania, we took them out in the field. We showed them how to use binoculars. We showed them where otters go to the bathroom. They were thrilled. I also did programs about my dogs. They don't have pets over there the way we do, so they were just amazed by my Labrador retrievers sleeping in the bed. But they have so little, and they appreciated so much the opportunity to get out in the field. And I think it would be great for our kids to have a chance to interact with those, even if it's just virtually. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to be done with the otters that are positive from a human standpoint, that would also benefit the otter, that would also benefit aquatic conservation. And that's really what I want to focus on the rest of my life, getting kids more involved in educational outreach efforts focused on the otter. And it's easy for me I've worked with the otter for so long, it's easy animal for me to have that focus. So it's also really nice for me to have the opportunity to come and speak with people who are willing to come out in the evening, on a very cold evening, by the way, and learn about otters. So I really appreciate being here, and I appreciate being invited to be here. Thank you. And I know I went a little long, and I apologize for that.
Hello, and welcome to the Conservation Way podcast, coming to you from the National Conservation Training Center studio near Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm Randy Robinson, and today we are very glad to be talking about river otters with a pioneer of otter restoration programs. Dr. Tom Serfass is a professor of wildlife ecology at Frostburg State University in Frostburg, Maryland. His research and conservation work involved the design, implementation, and evaluation of wildlife restoration programs and recovering wildlife populations. Tom conceived and coordinated the successful Pennsylvania river otter and fisher reintroduction projects and has authored many journal articles and book chapters on river otters, fishers, and wildlife reintroductions. His teaching and research has taken him from the Appalachian rivers to Lake Victoria in Tanzania, where he worked with spotted-necked otters. Tom is the North American coordinator of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Otter Specialist Group. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for joining us today.
Nice to be here, Randy.
So I've got a million questions about river otters. I think they're a favorite of many people, just because I think they seem to know how to have a good time. But what got you first interested in river otters?
You know, I get asked that question quite often, and it's interesting with all the options we have on television and social media now to look at a variety of animal species. But when I was growing up, I would visit my uncle on his farm, and we would pick when the different National Geographic specials were coming out. And you know, then it wasn't the next night, it would be several months, you know, but those National Geographic specials really captured my attention as a little boy. And the other thing is, you know, and sometimes you get criticized for talking about Walt Disney and their humanization of animals, but there were some specials on river otters, and as I recall, seeing these river otters sliding down the banks, the snowy banks, and for whatever reason, I don't know if I can target the specific reason, but I think some of that early media that I listened to had a big influence. And I grew up in a rural area, so I was outdoors hunting and fishing all the time also. But for whatever reason, I was always fascinated with river otters, and then I started bouncing around among different colleges and met up with a graduate student who was working with river otters in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I just continued working with that animal for 2 graduate degrees and professionally. And basically I can thank the river otter for my career in wildlife.
That is great. I know, I agree that good old Walt Disney and National Geographic and Jacques Cousteau's specials that we saw when we were kids, I think they influenced a lot of people.
You know, it's interesting. I'd be at parties in high school, and everybody would be doing what young people do at the parties. But if a Jacques Cousteau special was on, I would turn that on in whoever living room we happened to be in. And you know, the interesting thing is, watching that, everybody else started gravitating around it too. So I think some of those specials and some of those unique people really had a big influence on many of us.
Well, I think that you know, today we can say that the otter is a conservation success story. But we'll get into the reintroduction part of it in a little bit. But give us a little background on what caused the decline in otter and fisher populations back 100 years ago or so.
Yeah, and beyond. I mean, if you read some of the early stories about the mountain man era, and which was focused on trapping, which primarily beaver, but otter were part of that that emphasis also. And as a profession, wildlife and fisheries hasn't been around all that long, starting really in the late 1800s, early 1900s in its infancy. Prior to that, it was a free-for-all, and we had market hunting going on, and the purpose was to obtain as much from a wildlife standpoint that benefited us economically. And the otter was part of that unregulated early fur trade. And it started in the east, of course, and as the east developed, we moved westward, and it was a species that was impacted severely. I think the association with the beaver trapping was part of that, but they have an extremely dense, valuable fur that was prized by the early fur market also. And when you have an animal that is really restricted as to where it's going to occur in the landscape, in this case, the aquatic system, you're not going to have a lot of them. And an animal like the otter, which is predatory, they tend to have fairly low population densities. So they were easily impacted by unregulated trapping.
And then later on, we had industrial growth and pollution of rivers and streams, and logging, and none of that helped as far as their habitat was greatly diminished.
You're absolutely right, and it's hard to imagine as we drive through the landscape now, and a lot of my experience is in Pennsylvania. So if you go through north central Pennsylvania now, lots of public lands, lots of state forests, state parks, the Allegheny National Forest in the northwest, and it's all green, it's all trees again, but that area was shaved bare. And a colleague of mine, since retired, Jerry Hassinger, I refer to him as the closest thing to Aldo Leopold that Pennsylvania's ever seen. He tells this, he creates this story of the impacts of erosion and siltation and just changes in the availability of different habitats when the trees were removed from those ridges. And really in north central Pennsylvania, it was all basically shaved bare of trees. And when Jerry talks about it, the siltation and the erosion had to impact the fisheries. The logs being floated down the streams and rivers to markets had to have a big impact on the riparian habitat that the otters use for denning. So their food is being impacted. Their den sites and resting sites are being impacted. We have unregulated trapping occurring, and then as industrialization occurs, various impacts. And in Pennsylvania, the coal industry and oil industry had big impacts on the aquatic systems in many parts of the state, particularly the west.
And I grew up in western Pennsylvania, and we had a lot of acidic mine drainage coming out of the mines that kind of sterilized the rivers and streams. The good news is that a lot of it's been cleaned up in the last 50 or so years, and otters and other wildlife are coming back. So give us a little background on your introduction work. How does that work? You've introduced somewhere around 150 otters back to the wild?
Yeah, it depends on how you go about counting it, because, well, first of all, an otter could care less if it is on the Pennsylvania side of a river or the New York side of the river, or the Pennsylvania side of a river and the Maryland side of the river. So we cooperated with the state of Maryland and New York also in reintroduction projects. So we're well over 200 released if you look at the joint effort among the states. And I think it was really good to think beyond just a particular state and how it would how the reintroduced populations would interact and expand to neighboring states. But the otter in Pennsylvania, I'll speak about Pennsylvania as well, but we're one of many states that have reintroduced otters now. And the fact that many states were reintroducing otters is a pretty good indication of the problems that the animal encountered in having to be reintroduced in so many areas. But the fact that we're doing reintroductions also points positively to what a lot of really good conservationists did to improve the quality of our aquatic systems, from private NGOs like Trout Unlimited to, and I slight people when I don't, or groups when I don't mention everyone, but Trout Unlimited has been a great organization for promoting aquatic conservation. The state agency work, the federal agency work, and the legislators who put forth the clean water regulations, including the Clean Water Act. So in Pennsylvania, the otter had been reduced to a small population in the northeastern quarter of the state. Most people think of as the Pocono Mountains. And it was protected from unregulated trapping because there were a lot of large private hunting and fishing clubs that really excluded the general public from access to those areas, and many of them have been around for a very, very long time. It was a recreational area. It wasn't an industrial area, so it didn't have the level of pollutants. And it also was glaciated, so it had a lot more in the way of aquatic habitats than, say, central Pennsylvania, where it's all sort of linear riverine systems, rivers and streams, whereas in the Poconos you have the rivers and streams, but they're connecting lakes, swamps, bogs, so more aquatic habitat for the otter. So the otters persisted there, and that was one of the sources of otters we used when conditions got better elsewhere in the state to reintroduce them.
Very interesting. So I know you don't do it yourself. You've got graduate students that have helped you. I know you've mentored a number of PhD and master's students over the years. And you have your dog Merlin. Tell us about Merlin.
Well, first of all, he's a yellow lab, and he makes me happy, first of all. I love having him along with me. He's a great companion along the rivers. But he picked up really quickly on finding otter latrine sites. And latrine sites are where otters come out of the water and they do scent marking. They'll go to the bathroom there, and they have other scents that they'll deposit there. It serves as a communication social area for them, also a territorial boundary. And most of us don't get to see otters, and that includes me. They're hard to see in the wild. They're often very nocturnal, especially if there's a lot of people around. So we're looking for these latrines where their droppings are and other telltale signs of them being present. And so Merlin picked up pretty quickly on what I was looking for, and now I just tell him latrine, and he starts searching. And I've looked for otter latrines for a long time, so I think I'm pretty good at it at this point. But we were doing a survey on the Conemaugh River up in southwestern Pennsylvania, and I had walked by this area, and I turn around and Merlin is digging at the site. So his nose finds latrines in some cases better than my eyes do.
And then once you find a latrine, where do you go from there?
Well, the latrines serve a lot of purposes. One, I mean, it's kind of the standby for determining if otters are in an area. But we can collect the droppings and analyze what are in the droppings to determine what they're eating. We can do genetic studies from the droppings. But basically, when we find a latrine, we mark it on a GPS. And I've had graduate students work on developing mathematical models for predicting where the latrine sites are, which we can use aerial photography to locate best sections of streams from those models and minimize the cost and time required to find if otters are in an area. Merlin does not use the mathematical models. He seems to do quite well without that.
So when you're looking at an area that you're thinking about, this might be a good area to reintroduce otters into, what criteria do you have for choosing an area like that for reintroduction?
You know, it's a host of things, and some of the things may not seem as obvious as others. Clearly we want to make sure it has a good fish population, which is the primary food of otters. Crayfish is another very important food. So we're looking initially for an adequate prey base to feed the animal. Then we consider remnants of various potentially toxic pollutants, PCBs, remnants of DDT, which is often manifests itself. That's diminishing since we have stopped the use of DDT in this country. But when we started, we looked for that, and we would still find evidence of DDE in the tissue of fish. So we didn't want to have a lot of contaminants in the primary prey area. We wanted areas that had adequate riparian cover. When I say riparian, I'm referring to shoreline cover. Places where the otters could find refuge, because they swim in the water, they feed in the water, but when they are resting, they are on the land, usually near the water in those riparian areas. We look for beaver populations, because beaver create nice habitat for otters, both in terms of the dams, but also the structures they make along the shorelines and their dams in ponds. And otters will use those as refuge also. We also did not want to create a population that became isolated. We wanted to pick areas where the otters could establish themselves but then expand. So we would release otters on interconnected drainages. We would release them on river systems where they weren't going to run into a bottleneck, a barrier such as acid mine drainage. And we found that initially in the Susquehanna drainage in north central Pennsylvania, the west branch of the Susquehanna. But that's a common theme. We look for situations where there would be interconnectivity, where the otters could expand, and then eventually the different reintroduced populations could come together and reinvigorate one another.
Now, we know beavers build a lodge to live in, but what do otters do? Do they dig a den underground, or how do they survive in the wintertime?
Common wisdom is that they will modify holes in the banks, tree root systems, things like that, but they generally aren't digging their own dens. They'll use abandoned beaver lodges, and those beavers will also dig holes in the banks. Everyone thinks of the lodges that they create, but they'll also create bank dens also. So the otters will use those as well. And generally, if we have undisturbed riparian areas, they're going to have adequate refuge. We found that. They like large rock formations also. So it's a variety of things that they will use for cover, for resting and denning. And generally, if it's an undisturbed riparian system, they'll find those. We found that in every reintroduction site that we've used.
So after an otter has been reintroduced and maybe they're doing well and the population's coming up, do otters travel very far? In other words, would they go from one stream headwaters to another stream and then repopulate an adjoining stream? They can
and do move over land. It's not their primary mode of travel, but they will travel over land. And probably the most unique situation that we had was an otter that we released on the Loyalsock Creek in north central Pennsylvania. And we released him. He moved all night long, the first period that we released him. And I went to bed. I think I went back to the camp at about 4 a.m., got up sometime mid-morning, started looking for him again, couldn't find him. Kept looking. We flew across northern Pennsylvania, couldn't find him, and we never did find him. And I forget the exact amount of time later, but we got notification from the New York DEC that an otter with an ear tag, a Pennsylvania ear tag, had been killed near the Buffalo area. So that animal, he had to cross multiple drainage systems to get where he went. Fortunately, this was an anomaly and not typical, but it does demonstrate that they have considerable ability to travel overland. And I think a male sets out, and at some point we get to the breeding season. He's going to start looking for females to breed with, and if he doesn't find them, I think my thoughts are that he'll just keep searching if he doesn't find any, and that was probably the situation here.
Wow, that's impressive.
It was a long way.
You mentioned beavers. Do otters and beavers get along with each other?
Generally, otters are not using active beaver lodges, but with the otter, I hedge almost everything that I say, because we did have one otter early. It was a female that we released in the Kettle Creek drainage, again in north central Pennsylvania, and she, I thought something had happened to her because she became fairly isolated during the winter months, and finally we found evidence of her leaving this small beaver pond. But she was in and out of the lodge there, and it was active. I'm not sure that the beavers liked having her in the lodge with her, but I think they were in and out of the same lodge. The beavers or the otter could have been using some bank lodges in that area, but they had to be interacting closely with one another. Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, you also have worked a lot with fishers. Tell us a little bit about fishers. I know they're in the weasel family like otters are.
Yeah, that's an interesting one also, because I think the otter really paved the way for the fisher reintroduction in Pennsylvania. And we released 190 fishers in north central Pennsylvania using the same basic conceptual model. The habitat selection. One thing I didn't mention about the conceptual model is the social aspect, because we're reintroducing carnivores that have not been in the landscape for a long period of time, and people are going to be naive about how they function in the landscape. So it's up to us as wildlife professionals to educate. And when I say educate, I know I'm getting off the fisher here, but I think this is important. Education should not be manipulation. I mean, wildlife professionals, we have an interest in restoring wildlife populations. We hope that the public is interested also, which is what we found with the river otter. But we did a lot of informing with the otter, and the otter became a very popular species in Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, it's on the license plate. You may have seen that.
Yes.
And when anybody buys that license plate, $15 goes to wildlife conservation projects, which is really nice. So I think the success of the otter project in Pennsylvania made it a little bit easier for us to reintroduce this other predator, the fisher. And it is a large tree climbing member of the weasel family, and the otter's a member of the weasel family also. But there's been a lot of misconceptions about what the fisher does in the landscape also, and its food habits. And we used the same basic educational approach, and had pretty strong support early on with the Fisher Project also.
Now, reading some books on the old logging days in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, throughout the Appalachians, the old timers, the loggers, called fishers woods cats. Have you heard them called that?
Actually, I haven't heard that one. I've heard a lot of other names, but not woods cats. That's an interesting one.
They kind of got that round face, I guess they reminded those guys of a little bit of a cat.
Yeah, I can see that now that you mention it. No, I have not heard that term. But here again, it's a species that is dependent on a specific type of habitat, in this case, a forested landscape. But there's been a lot of misconceptions among professionals over the last 40 or 50 years in terms of what fishers actually need. And the thought was that they needed mature, basically old-growth conifer forest to thrive in. And we're finding that's not the case. They are more of a forest generalist than once thought. We did a project, and I don't know if your listeners will be that familiar with North Dakota, but fishers are actually occurring in North Dakota. They did historically, but eastern North Dakota is largely an agricultural landscape now. The only forested areas are pretty much along the riverine systems, the Red River drainage. So we did a project out there just to see if fishers were occurring, because the thought was they had started showing up. And I had a graduate student do some modeling, and we did some genetics work also. So these fishers were moving along the forested riverine corridors from Minnesota. They crossed the Red River. And so we have this perception of an animal that can only survive in big, old-growth conifer habitats, which is not the case out there at all. And we actually have photos of fishers running through soybean fields out there. Now, they're not making a living in soybean fields. You know, they're searching for forested habitat, but no one 40 or 50 years ago would have believed that we're going to have fishers running through soybean fields. The paradigm was they need forest cover over their back. They won't leave an area that's forested to venture into to open areas.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of folks out there, when they hear the word otter, they probably think of sea otters. We've seen photos and video of sea otters laying on their back and eating a shell, an abalone maybe. But are river otters and sea otters related?
They are. So 13 otter species. Actually, there's another one now. There's just been, through genetic work, they've one of the Mesoamerican and South American species has been divided into separate species recently. But yeah, the sea otter is a relative of the North American river otter. I only wish I could make our river otter as visible as the sea otter. The sea otter is a very popular animal. It attracts lots of tourist attention in many areas. And when people can see the river otter, they love to see it, but it's they're very often nocturnal, and it's a rich treat to get to see one in the wild.
I've seen two in my entire life. One was almost dark on Big Sandy Creek. I thought it was a beaver at first, but it was definitely an otter. Went under my canoe, came up on the other side. The other one was in Pennsylvania. He was out in an ice floe, and it was a sunny day. I was very surprised to see him. Kind of a nice-sized otter.
So you're from that area, and we released them on the Allegheny River at Kennerdale. My guess is that was what time of the year did you see that? How many years ago was that on Big Sandy Creek?
This was 35 years ago on Big Sandy near Brewston Mills. I'm guessing he might have came from the Youghiogheny River drainage.
Yeah.
Because Big Sandy's kind of right on the other side of the mountain.
Okay.
But that was, probably 35 years ago.
You know, and some of those otters, whether they're coming down the Allegheny River from Kennerdale or moving north from Ohiopyle State Park along the Youghiogheny River into the Menon, they're showing up on the Conemaugh River now. And that was a badly degraded river. Here again, a wonderful conservation organization has been working for years on improving the water quality. They've been succeeding, and otters are naturally colonizing that tributary also in the Allegheny drainage.
That is great. It's a real treat to see them in the wild. What would you like the public to know or appreciate about river otters and fishers?
Well, I think on a big scale, on a large, thinking conceptually, it highlights the fact that we've come a long way professionally as a society, that we are starting to welcome back predatory animals. And in the early part of the 1900s and, really since the foundation of our country, predators have not been welcomed. And so we're seeing this change in thought and a greater appreciation of the role predators play in natural systems. And also the fact that we have recovered habitats that were largely lost to these species through good conservation work by many, many individuals and organizations, including the government agencies that are responsible for managing wildlife in the United States. I mean, it's an amazing success story because during some of the periods where the environment was really being badly degraded and we weren't thinking carefully about how we conserve wildlife, I think it's a remarkable success story for both species. And the fisher has expanded considerably also. In the east it was largely pushed up into northern New England states, and it's doing quite well down through Pennsylvania and parts of the Appalachians now, West Virginia, Maryland.
Well, Tom, we want to thank you for all your great work over the years in making that happen with otters and fishers and all the super work you've done. It's great to see them coming back, and it is a conservation success story. And so for our listeners on the podcast, If you'd like to see Tom's full presentation, he'll be here at the National Conservation Training Center this evening doing one of our conservation lecture series. And next week we'll have that up on YouTube. It'll be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's YouTube page. In about a week you'll find that there along with this interview. So thank you very much for joining us today on Conservation Way. And Tom, thank you much for making the trip here to talk with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.